The lectionary for this coming week has assigned us the Decalogue as one of our readings, and that's from Exodus chapter 21 through 17. It's pretty familiar to us. The gospel passage is also more familiar. It's one of the few passages that appear in all four gospels. It's Jesus cleansing the temple from the account of the Gospel of John, which happens really early on in John in chapter 2, as opposed to really late in the other three Gospels, when it happens right before Jesus's at the Passover, right before Jesus's trial and crucifixion. So that's the setting for all of this, and it's Lent. So we're going to talk about what do we do about all of this. We haven't had a discussion about ethics as a discipline yet, so this is going to be our first time through, and it's such an encompassing topic that there's no way that we can talk about the Decalogue. Even if we were just to try to talk about the Ten Commandments, there's no way I would make it through that. So this is going to be part one. Maybe in 3 years, we'll pick it up again. I don't know when, but we're going to go for a bit more depth at the sacrifice of covering it all tonight. Okay, so just some framing information. We are going to talk about case studies tonight. So one of them is the recent ruling about IVF embryos that are fertilized outside of the womb, that are kept as stored as fertilized embryos, and that those have been ruled as people by the Alabama Supreme Court. As a result, the killing or the destruction of those embryos, now it's called killing, is regarded as murder. So that is punishable. That has resulted in the immediate cessation of IVF fertility treatments in the state of Alabama as a result, because clinics do not want to be prosecuted for murder. Some framing information for you that's important. 2% of all births in the United States at this point are via IVF. So that's 1 out of 50 people. There are now, at this point, 8 million children, no longer just children. It's been around for 40 years. There are 8 million people that are walking around in this country that would not be here without IVF at this point. So we have a population that in excess of 330 million. 8 million is a significant percentage of that. It's not, one in, like 100 million people. It's quite a bit. It's appreciable. It's less than 1 in 1,000, for example. And we have, as our current statistics as of February of this year, a 0.7% growth rate in this country. And we have something upwards of 10 million jobs that are unfilled, 10 million jobs that are needed, not just that we could add 10 million more people to the workforce if we had to. We have 10 million unfilled jobs at this moment. Okay, so that's some important information. So is this right or wrong? Let's ask the 10 Commandments. And also let me get my screen unstuck because I can't advance the next slide. There we go. Case study number 2. This was pulled down from Saturday from the news. There is what is being called an immigration crisis. Whether that is true or not is up for debate. But let's say that there is a large number of immigrants who are crossing into the United States from both northern and southern borders. It's not just from the southern border, but because of policies designed by a few of our states at the southern border, many of these immigrants are ending up in cities that are not close to a border, cities like New York, Denver, and Chicago. The funding for these migrants generally is federal, but the federal funding hasn't been enough. So a lot of the funding to be able to house, to be able to feed, to be able to keep these people in good health until they're able to have their immigration status decided, or until they're able to find legal work, is paid for by these cities, and they're running out of money. So some information that's necessary for us to think about this, what should be done. So the question is not, is this right or wrong here? It's what should be done. That we are not nearly at our peak net migration. So the idea that we are being overwhelmed or invaded is false. Our peak of net immigration to the country actually was in 2016 at 1.6 million people. And that has dropped precipitously in 2021 during COVID. It was 376,000 people, down from 1.6 million. A large amount of that, the net immigration was the decrease in net immigration was because of a policy enacted in April of 2020 called Title 42, enacted by the Trump administration, that allowed for mass deportations of people arriving at our borders. And that was declared under a COVID emergency mandate, and it was thought to be a health precaution. Whether it was actually a health precaution is up for you to decide. Title 42 was stopped in May of 2023, so we're not yet a year without that, and that is what has led to the increase relative to during COVID, but it is not an unusual number relative to pre-COVID numbers. Of the people that are coming in currently, our statistics show that about 54% of them are single adults, 41% are traveling families, and 5%, this is crazy, 5% are unaccompanied minors. Families are the increasingly larger share. That is the part that is growing. Historically, it is true that most have been coming from Mexico as their place of origin, or the Northern Triangle, and that's the countries of Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador, where low economic opportunities, but most importantly, political unrest and wars have made life unfeasible. The wars didn't just happen by themselves. These wars are remnants of proxy battles that were fought starting after World War II, during the Cold War, oftentimes instigated by the United States in an attempt to protect the American sphere of influence in Central America. This includes the US-backed anti-communist Contras in Nicaragua, who famously became part of the scandal during the Reagan administration. And they were opposed to the freedom movement, the FSLN, which had overthrown a 46-year-long dictatorship. So those would normally be the good guys, people that overthrow dictators, freedom fighters, except we opposed that because we didn't know if they would be friendly to us or they would be friendly to our enemies, people that we thought of our enemies. We've given $4 billion of money to El Salvador to fund a civil war against a different faction called the FMLN, which is a coalition of left-wing revolutionaries. The CIA backed a coup in Guatemala, that led to 34 years of civil war. So the wars that people are fleeing are oftentimes the result of American meddling in these countries. Okay, some more information that's important. In December 2023, 54% of the immigrants to the United States were citizens of countries other than the four that I just mentioned. Majority of them now, and a large part of that is Venezuela, 47,000, which a year before that, in 2022, was only 6,000, so from 6,000 to 47,000. And they currently make up the second largest group, and that's generally because of civil unrest and poor economic opportunities in Venezuela. One of the surprising groups that you might not think about is the number of citizens of China, which currently stands at 6,000 people a year. And that's an increasingly large number. So even if China isn't anywhere near any of our southern neighbors, many citizens of China are choosing to enter the United States through our southern border, flying into places like Panama and then walking all the way up to our border with Mexico. And that's especially important given that many of us have immigrant histories that trace their way back through parts of Asia. Keep in mind that over 1 million US citizens died during COVID. And again, there are 10 million currently unfilled jobs in the United States. And a recent report from the university, or rather American University in Washington, D.C., Immigration Lab calculated that the net economic benefit from immigrants and their families have given us a $2 trillion boost to the labor market. Cool. So I pose the question again, what does Exodus say that we should do about these things? I'm not going to read Exodus 20 because it's something that I think most of us are familiar with, although translation does matter when it comes to this because this has been so studied to the point that we might not even really remember what it says anymore. We just know a general impression that one of them is about killing, something like that. Whether it says murder or killing, who knows? We don't remember, certainly. But the point is that if we were to go based on just the 10 Commandments, we wouldn't be able to decide either of these two problems, which are arguably two of the most important problems that are facing our political climate today. And we've got big decisions this year. So Where else in the Bible can we look to? Does the Bible talk about immigrants? Yes, it does. And it's very, very hostile to them, in fact. So that's not great. What about artificial fertilization? The Bible doesn't say anything about that at all. So we're going to have to think of other ways. And that's the point of tonight's Bible study. Okay, since we've got the scripture up, the passage, I'm going to just make some brief remarks and know that I have an obligation to come back at some future date to talk about the Ten Commandments in more depth another time. And we'll do that, but just not tonight. We're going to be very careful about which parts we talk about just to have a more focused discussion. Okay, so Exodus 20, what it is, it's an obligation. It's a law that results from God saving the Hebrew people from slavery in Egypt. Look at verses 1 to 2. That's a really important part that we oftentimes forget. It's a law, but more importantly, it's the law which forms half of God's covenant. So the first part was God saving the people. The second part is, now that I saved you, this is what saving you obliges you to me. I did the first part. Now you've got to come back with the second part. It is a covenant, and it's modeled after political treaties that we know were common in the ancient Near East at this time period. And they were usually between an overlord, like a big, massive empire like the Babylonian or the Syrian Empire, and a vassal state. So based on that type of political treaty between the controlling power and a smaller, less powerful vassal state, that is the language of covenant that's used throughout God's interaction with the people. And it's not that God actually spoke this way. We think that the people took the model of covenant, or rather of covenant, that of treaty that had been given to them by their Babylonian and Syrian conquerors, and thought of that as a way that God would similarly talk to them, God being overwhelmingly powerful compared to them, in the same way that the Syrians and the Babylonians were overwhelmingly powerful compared to them as well, just in the political sphere. So that's why there's some sense that when these laws are broken, the aggrieved party isn't if you steal, the aggrieved party isn't the person you stole from. Or if you lie, the aggrieved party isn't the person you lie to. The aggrieved party is God, God's self. That's who gets hurt when you break one of these commandments. It's also important to note that it's not just the covenant. It's not just a law. This is actually God's revealing God's self. You learn something about God by reading these. So some things that it's not. It's not clear to say that this is binding on folks who do not descend from the people freed from slavery in Egypt, right? If this is a covenant as a consequence of God saving people from slavery in Egypt, I don't trace my ancestry back through Hebrew people. That does this law apply to me? I think it's an open question. As it's written here, it does not. Although it is later clarified in the writings of Paul and Jesus that the law does apply. So that's our current context. But when we look at the text itself, when we say Exodus 20, what does Exodus 20 mean to me? We can't interpret it really without all of that other context. But this text, when we just talk about Exodus 20, as opposed to our understanding of the Ten Commandments, we have to think differently. And so the point here is that Exodus 20 is not the same thing as the Ten Commandments, primarily because we interpret the Ten Commandments through later writings. They're added on in many places. So the Ten Commandments are referenced throughout the prophets, throughout even the book of Exodus. They also are contained in a complete second copy in the book of Deuteronomy chapter 5. When I say complete second copy, I do not mean exact copy. There are modifications. And when these verses are quoted later on, they're also modified as well. It shows a continuing understanding. So even if these are the words of God spoken directly, it did not mean that the people didn't feel some freedom to continue to interpret, to add to clarify. And so perhaps that gives us permission to do the same thing. The Decalogue, the 10 words, the 10 Commandments are not closed specifically. It's also not fair to say that this is the law. When people talk about the law later on, they're not just referring to this. This is the beginning of the law. The law goes all the way through the end of Exodus, all the way through the book of Leviticus, all the way to Numbers chapter 10. That is the law. So this is one small part of what is the law. But what makes this different than the rest of that, why this has a unique part of our imagination, and we can probably all maybe at least number a few of them, whereas I don't think most of us can name 10 different things in the rest of the book of Exodus, Leviticus, or the first chapter of Numbers. What makes this different is that this, according to the narrative, is the only part of the law that's heard by all the people. So what they heard was God speaking in thunder, of course. We're not clear that they actually understood these words. But the rest of it was only heard by Moses and relayed to the people secondhand. So the idea that Moses comes down with these 2 tablets and on it are just the 10 commandments is Carlton Heston, not the Bible, because what was contained on those were all of the rest of Exodus, all of Leviticus, and the first 10 chapters of Numbers. That's the law. This is just a small part of it. So in verse 18, which starts right after what we have on our screen, the narrative continues to say, all the people witnessed the thunder and lightning, the blare of the horn and the mountain smoking, and when the people saw it, they fell back and stood at a distance. You speak to us, they said to Moses, and we will obey, but let God speak to us, lest we die. Moses answered the people, be not afraid, for God has come only in order to test you, and in order that the fear of God may be ever with you, so that you do not go astray. So the people remained at a distance while Moses approached the thick cloud where God was. Yahweh said to Moses, thus you shall say to the Israelites, you yourself saw that I spoke to you from the very heavens. So what was the point of the people hearing these 10 commandments? Remember, it's said to them in thunder and lightning, and I'm not quite sure many of them were fluent in the language of thunder and lightning. The point was not to understand and to follow and to obey. That's why they were written down later, so in ways that they could intelligibly understand and remember. The point of this law was so that the people would know, all the people would know and never doubt that God was speaking to Moses, because the people were terrified. They didn't want to hear any more. The thunder and lightning scared them. So they said, Moses, now we understand why you're here. You go up the mountain and you talk to God by yourself. Spare us this terror. And then just tell us what happens later on. The point was that they would trust that Moses was God's designated prophet. That's the point of them hearing this law. That's what the narrative says. So that's important for us to understand as well. Okay, let's give some more background. It was not written in Sinai. It was not written at a mountain. It is not even thought to be understood or referenced by the first 40 chapters of Isaiah. So Isaiah 1 doesn't know that this exists. Ezekiel doesn't know that this exists. Amos seems to have no clue that this law exists. It's written sometime after those prophets. So probably right around the time that Deuteronomy was written as well, during the reign of King Josiah, sometime maybe around the exile. So it is not one of the ancient writings. In fact, there is a large portion of the kingdoms of Israel and Judah that are ignorant of this ever existing. It's not central to the history, but it does color all of the history after it. It is part of the Elohist tradition, which is important for us to understand what the Elohist thinks about God and to add that as part of our understanding. The Elohist thinks of God as being terrifying. The Elohist also talks about dreams and miracles. The Elohist is most notable in Genesis for the story about Joseph and being able to communicate to God, or God communicating to Joseph through dreams. That's the Elohist's shtick. Also the golden calf is part of the Elohist tradition. If we're looking at the Hebrew itself, every time you shows up, it's important to note that that is in the second person singular. You is one of those words in English that we can't tell if you means all of you or you as a person. There is not a single instance of the word you in this that is plural. So it is always talking to you as an individual. It means that these commands bind on you as a person, how you live your life, not the community as a whole. It is a legal code. It is very, very, very specific. It is hard to make large extrapolations and lessons out of this code. It is very, very specific in its use of words. Many of these words actually are so specific that they're hard to understand because they appear so few other times in the Bible. There is a very common word for killing. In verse 13, that's not the word that they use. They use a verse that's a word for killing that's really shows up only a couple of other places. And we're not completely sure what it means as a result because we don't have context. As best as we can figure, this is not a prohibition against all killing. It seems more like a prohibition against premeditated murder. For example, So there are 8 negatives and 2 positives. We think that they were all originally negative. But as it stands today, there are 2 positive. It's interesting to note what things it says you can't do. They all seem to operate at the edges of life, preventing really bad things from happening, but not necessarily informing our everyday actions. It's not every day that most of us have to think to ourselves, do I have to murder today or not? Am I going to steal? Am I going to commit adultery? These are not actions that pertain to the individual day-to-day decisions that we need to make ethical decisions. It's more like, I don't know, smaller things, I guess, everyday things, but not these things. So what it seems to be really concerned about is not telling us how to live our lives, but mainly constraining us from the really bad things from happening. It is fairly comprehensive. It talks about our relationship with God, with neighbor, with nature. One thing it doesn't say is anything about how you're supposed to take care of yourself. And that's something notable as well. It also doesn't mention anything about things like rape. It doesn't say anything about racism. Things that we think of as being big problems, systemic problems. It doesn't say anything about excessive profit or greed. So, it's important for us to note what this is and what it isn't. Okay, let's go on. Case study number 3. If we ignore the fact that we're talking about the death penalty, which is hard to ignore, of course, this is an article that came out just yesterday. It's talking about, it's been found that in North Carolina, at a county as well as a state level, that Black jurors are struck at alarmingly large rates compared to white jurors with the same maybe problems. For example, we know that if we look at the criminality of potential juror pools, that Black jurors are struck at 3 times the rate that white jurors are in trials of Black people, producing all white juries that are more likely to convict, oftentimes with very severe consequences. So what do we do about racism? The Bible, not just the Decalogue, but the entire Bible is silent on this factor. So does that mean that we're not to care as Christians? What about war? I mean, I don't have that as a case study. The Bible is silent about war, condemning it. And Jesus has a chance to talk to a soldier, and all he says is, don't be greedy. Doesn't say, what are you doing, killing on behalf of an emperor far away, conquering foreign lands? Doesn't say anything about that. He just says, don't be greedy. So there are limits here. Okay. Finally, so we've got 3 case studies to think about. This is the runner show for tonight for the next, the 37 minutes we've got left. So we're going to talk about ethical processes. We're going to talk about 2 models of, I haven't told you what a model is yet, but we're going to talk about 2 models. We're going to talk about virtue ethics. We're going to talk about the 10 Commandments and some application. This is a highly atypical Bible study. So we'll figure out what this needs, what we need. So this is how to make a consistent moral decision and how not to. So the first thing, let's ask ourselves a question. Why do ethicists disagree about people that are professional ethicists, people that have a doctorate or that work in universities in philosophy departments? They don't all say the same thing about really important problems. It's not because some of them are smarter than others and that if they were all equal intelligence, they would all agree. It's because of this red arrow here, that they picked different ethical methods. So we oftentimes think that ethics is in these last 2 steps about making a decision and then acting on that. That's what most of us think it means to be moral or ethical in life. But it's invisible to us what's happening either because it's subconscious or what's not happening at all, which is a little bit more disturbing, is that we've had to decide what is our basis for making an ethical decision and how do we understand the problem itself. Describing the problem differently, how much information you have and which facts you pay attention to, will color the outcome. So what I'd like to suggest is that we shouldn't be just describing the problem, asking ourselves, well, how do I feel about this? What do I feel is the right thing? Or what does the Bible say? And then acting upon that. That is not a way to make a consistent moral decision, although sometimes it might agree in the end with what we're supposed to do, because it asks us to, based on our feelings in that moment, based on whatever passage we're consulting. We're clearly not reading the entire Bible cover to cover each time we have a question of it, that there is no consistency. And even if we did, the Bible disagrees with itself in so many places that consulting the Bible wouldn't necessarily give us a concrete answer. So, going back to the top of this slide, I'd suggest that the moral choice is actually when we pick our ethical model, our method. That's what actually determines the outcome. And so that means that we have to look at different models and figure out which one we want to use for ourselves. And we're going to disagree on that, and that's fine. But that picking a model is oftentimes what determines the outcome. And I'm going to show you that by applying different models to the same case study and showing you how different models will completely disagree with each other. And so it depends which model I picked, what I will think is the ethical choice at the end. But we don't oftentimes ascribe much ethical behavior or much ethical responsibility to picking our model, because it's oftentimes given to us. People tell us how to behave as ethical people, but we're still responsible for those decisions. So at the very least, we could be conscious of what we're doing and take responsibility for it, which is our theme at the Giving Circle Church, right? Taking responsibility for our lives, for our faith. How do we do this? Okay, so what is an ethical method, a model? Interchangeable. It is the answer to these questions. What makes something right or wrong? Believe it or not, they're going to disagree on what makes something right or wrong. It also determines what questions we ask and what answers are important. Some of the examples of different models that are useful: consequentialism, deontology, the relational responsibility idea, and virtue ethics. Those are really big words, really confusing, really intimidating. Don't worry about them. We're going to break it down. So I'm only going to cover 3 of them tonight, and I'm going to cover 2 of them very briefly. Sort of tipping my hat. So the first is consequentialism. It's pretty straightforward. So let's answer the first question. What makes something right or wrong? What makes something right is that it has the best outcome for the most people. That outcome we call utility. That's why one form of consequentialism that's pretty prevalent is called utilitarianism, because it maximizes utility. Tells us that the moral action is the one that increases utility for the most people. The reason it's under the category of consequentialism is because if you understand, think about what I just described, that we look at the consequences of an action to ask, does it make the most number of people happy or not? Basically, does it increase the goodness for the greatest number? If it does, it's moral. If it doesn't, it is not moral. So let's apply this to the model. In the case of Alabama's IVF ruling, 8 million people are around because IVF is deemed legal. If IVF were made illegal, those people would not be here, so they would experience no utility. Yes, if we sidestep the question about whether those embryos count as people or not, regardless, because excess embryos are not used, they do not become people, so they don't experience happiness. So utilitarianism might suggest that we maximize happiness for a greater number of people by bringing those 8 million people into the world. Otherwise, if there were no IVF, they wouldn't exist at all. There are secondary benefits as well that they add to the labor force. Also, their families experience the benefit of having children. Remember now that 2% of all births are aided by IVF. They would not be possible. So a large number of families would be childless if not for IVF. So for all these reasons, utilitarianism might suggest that it is a better idea to be able to allow IVF. Let's go on to the case about racism in North Carolina. Utilitarianism asks about the greatest good for the greatest number. Knowing that Black people, any racial minority, is by definition a minority, utilitarianism does not ask at all what is good for them. Utilitarianism, remember, asks what is the greatest good for the greatest number. So utilitarianism would be asking what maximizes the benefit of the majority population. And by definition, that would never include people who are racial minorities. It would never include people who have disabilities. It would never include people who are LGBTQ, because we will never be the majority. So it's very difficult from a utilitarian perspective to ask about even care about what's good for a small number of people, because utilitarianism only looks at the greatest good for the greatest number. There are two flavors of utilitarianism: act utilitarianism and rule utilitarianism. Act utilitarianism looks at actions, consequences of actions, and asks what actions create the greatest good for the greatest number. Rule utilitarianism asks what rules, if followed, create the greatest good for the greatest number. Here, the ends always justify the means. It doesn't matter if someone gets hurt in the middle. If the greatest good for the greatest number is served, it is a moral action. So you're going to see a long parade of white people, white men. That's the field of ethics. It's sort of depressing. So the benefits here are clear decisions that can be quantified, because we are just counting numbers of people. If there are more people on one side of the scale and fewer on the other, we know what to do. And it creates a cohesion of community for the majority community. Criticism: ends justify means. Human beings are means. They're not ends in and of themselves. And minorities will never be benefited from this. Deontology, another scary word, but not too bad. Comes from Greek and means the study of law, or of moral obligation, really, obligation. Here we have a rule system or a moral system that's based on following laws, following moral laws. Main thinker here would be Immanuel Kant. He's the guy in the middle, although John Calvin was definitely a deontologist as well. He's the one on the left. It must be remembered whenever we're going to talk about Immanuel Kant that he lived in Königsberg and never left that city his entire life. So his understanding of really how the world worked at large was very limited. He did not experience many people that were very different from him. He assumed that all human beings were rational, had equal rational capacity. The idea that he came up with was that one must, not just should or can, but must, is obliged to act in the ways that benefit everyone. Everyone. So human beings are always the end here. They're never a means to an end. But we must do the things that are good for everyone to do. And that obligation, that sense of what you must do, was called a categorical imperative. I'm not mentioning that to confuse you or to intimidate you. I'm mentioning it because it's on the slide, so you can look it up later on. Put it into Wikipedia, put it into Google, and read more about this. Or YouTube is a great resource as well to have it explained really in depth. That's the only reason I'm mentioning it. But it's the idea that you must do the things that are good for everyone to do. So let's give an example how this works. Well, there are also, let me finish the slide. There are imperfect duties. So there are things that are not categorically imperative. There are things that are optional to do. And if you ignore them, it's not bad. If you do them, it's extra good. It's bonus. But laws carry an authority claim in this. Why are laws authoritative? Well, Kant thought it was because they were rational, that we could all think and spend a lot of time thinking and arrive at the exact same set of rational laws. Every human being would arrive at the same thing. And that's the kind of thinking that comes from a man who never left his own town. He didn't really meet very different people. He didn't understand that there were different cultural contexts, that different human beings have different assumptions about what's right and wrong. He assumed that we could all agree. Forms of deontological moral thinking are today known as things like natural law, the assumption that there are certain laws that are natural for all human beings to be able to recognize, certain moral laws that we would all agree because it's in our nature, it's just revealed to us. That's been largely disproven. Another form, which was more Calvin's kind of thing, was divine law, that a law was right simply because God said it was so. And that's generally the way that many people think about the Ten Commandments. It's always right. because God said so. That runs into problems when we interpret the commandment against killing as thou shalt not kill, because we all know that there are times to kill, self-defense, for example. Some people would say capital punishment. But if the blanket law is thou shalt not kill with no exceptions, well, then what are you to do about that? There are no exceptions. Deontology claims to be universal. It's binary. Things are right or wrong. It does treat people as an end, never a means to an end. But there's very little room for emotions or relationships or special exceptions because what someone means to you. Also, the laws are themselves taken to be authoritative, but we never talk about who is making laws. And if one of your laws was, for example, to follow the laws of your civil society, well, under apartheid in South Africa, you'd be in a bind because the systemic racism that was typical of South Africa until 1994 was legal. Let's remember that Hitler rose to power through legal democratic means, that Jim Crow, those laws were enacted through perfectly legal means. So the lawgiver's power is hidden, and it doesn't always mean that the laws are themselves just. Let's give an example. Why is lying wrong? So deontology, Kantian deontology would ask, well, what would happen if everyone does it? Because the things that you're supposed to do are the things that are good for everyone to do. If everyone lied, then words would become meaningless, is what Kant writes. So the reason that lying is wrong is not because it hurts someone. It's because it would be bad for everyone to do this. Why is stealing wrong? For Kant, the reason you should not steal is because if everyone stole, there would be no private property to steal. So there's a contradiction. But Kant goes one step further. Remember, there is an obligation in deontology. You must not lie. There's no room to ever make a mistake. You must not steal. There's never any room for any type of exception. For example, if you were a hacker and you could access a database that could prevent a nuclear catastrophe from happening, that would be wrong because there's never any exception that allows one to steal under Kant's deontology. So you see that these laws are inflexible. And even though they can be very thoughtful and, very smart people arrive at them, that doesn't mean that they necessarily conform to the ways that we live human life. So let's keep going. Ooh, I'm going to have to hurry up. Virtue ethics. Virtue ethics is the one that I actually like. It is old as well. It goes all the way back to Aristotle. It has been modified by St. Augustine and Thomas Aquinas. So it goes from the 4th century BCE all the way to the present. The two models that I've talked about so far, utilitarianism and consequentialism, both look at actions, right? To determine whether an action is moral or not. Is lying moral or not? Is racism moral or not? Virtue ethics looks at a different question. Virtue ethics asks, how to develop the virtuous person? What is a moral person? Not what is a moral action. So the assumption here is that moral decisions contribute to making moral people. Virtues sound really high, and mighty as an idea, very kind of difficult to nail down. Virtues are simply habits. They're the reality, the sum totality of what we are. And they're affected by every little decision that we make because habits are formed from small repetitive decisions every day. They essentially are our character. That's what a virtue is. Every little truth echoes a larger truth is one of the sayings here in virtue ethics. Essentially, virtue ethics is not asking about the specifics of a problem. So it's not asking what would happen if everyone did this. So for example, virtue ethics will instead ask 3 questions. Who am I? Question of identity. What am I supposed to become? Question of character. And how do I get there? A question of means. Who am I is formed oftentimes by our faith, by our Christian identity. What am I supposed to become can also be framed as a very religious question as well. What do we learn about human beings, human flourishing, as revealed through scripture, as revealed through tradition, as revealed through doctrine, as revealed through our personal relationship with God? So there are lists of virtues for virtue ethics. The cardinal virtues that Aquinas came up with were justice, fortitude, temperance, and prudence. Prudence is the hardest one to describe, but the others are words that we understand to some extent. Fortitude or courage, temperance, these are virtues that we aim to perfect. And the way that we perfect them, the knowledge of how to get better at these, that's what prudence is. Prudence guides us along our moral path, and it's a skill that we actually get better at, to know how to make more and more moral decisions. There are also theological virtues as well, hope, faith, and charity. I'm going to talk about those in just a second. But those are not really our responsibility. The great thing about virtue ethics is morality isn't an intellectual game. It's not something we think about and play, create hypothetical scenarios. It's literally about every single action that we take. Does this improve my understanding of justice? Does this improve further or take me further from fortitude, temperance, prudence? It also means that as Christians, we can share our faith by example. We don't need to argue whether someone is following the right laws, natural law or Christian law. All we have to do is live virtuously, live our lives so that we become closer and closer to these virtues. That's all it is. It's not reserved for people with doctorates. And it comes from a spirituality of helping people to essentially be the best that they can be. So it puts morality and spirituality in dialogue with each other. And it's sort of integrative in that sense, and it gets us to where we want to be in the very end. It dovetails very well with Christian faith. If we take utilitarianism, for example, this greatest good for the greatest number, then we're confronted by the story of the lost sheep, the parable of the lost sheep, where Jesus says, no, the kingdom of God is such that for one sheep, 99 will be put away. The shepherd will leave the 99 to search for the one lost sheep. Now, the thing about utilitarianism is that the greatest good for the greatest number has to be maximized. Jesus would never risk the health and safety of 99 sheep for one as utilitarian. And laws, if you look at the model of Jesus' life, laws don't seem to be terribly important to Jesus. Jesus interprets laws as he goes along, and his life becomes law. What he thinks about fasting as he's doing it. Is the fast made for the human or the human made for the fast? Jesus asks. The law is not universal in Jesus's case. So developing along a path towards the character that Jesus sets out for us is what virtue ethics asks. On the other hand, it's hard for virtues to be ever agreed upon. And there have been multiple lists of virtues throughout the last 2,400 years. We're never going to agree on this. So what utilitarianism and deontology both promise, that we will all agree on the same morals, that we all have moral clarity, and we will all know what to do and all agree on what the right thing to do is, that we will have a society that can agree, is never promised by virtue ethics. It promises a cacophony of people each trying to be their best person as they understand that to be. The great news is that there is always room for mistakes, that not everything damns you or praises you for all time. Habits are formed out of small actions, and each one incrementally brings you closer or farther from virtue. So you've always got another chance to make up for that, to keep getting back on the path towards virtue. And that can be a great thing. It also, on the other hand, means that everything matters. So these are the cardinal virtues and their vices. So virtues and vices are related in virtue ethics. Virtues are not something that we should pursue a maximum of. It's not the farthest in any way. Virtues are always the middle point between two extremes that are actually the vices. So too much of a virtue is not more virtuous. In fact, too much of a virtue becomes vice. Too little of a virtue also is a vice. So that's what excess or defect are. Defect too little, excess too much. So temperance, Each of these also things, these vices, virtues were associated with what was called back then an appetite. And it's a part of your soul, essentially. I just want to mention that also virtues and vices are not single acts. A single act of temperance does not make you virtuous. An act isn't how you are formed. An act is just one little step along the path of formation. Okay, so cardinal virtues are not perfect, but they are virtues. The perfect virtues are the theological virtues. But let's go back to the cardinal virtues. The concupiscible appetite, the thing that appreciates things that are good in and of themselves, things like drink and food and sex. Yes, he did say sex. I'm not making that up. Are best governed by temperance. Never too much, never too little. So the vice of excess of temperance is gluttony or self-indulgence. Too little? Also insensibility. If you never appreciate a beautiful meal, if you never appreciate in bonds of marriage, human intimacy, sexual intimacy, and you're very insensitive to that, then it's wasted on you. Something has gone wrong. The irascible will, or the will, is governed by courage. Too much of it, and then you become rash. You go off and do things that risk other people's health. You know, these are the people that are surfing waves in the middle of a hurricane. That's not courage, that's stupidity. Too little of courage is cowardice. So the virtue exists between two extremes of vice. The rational appetite is governed by justice. Too much of justice? Now that might seem strange to us. Sorry, I misspoke. The irascible appetite, it overcomes the obstacles between ourselves and justice. The irrational appetite is what we talk about as the will. It might seem weird to talk about too much of justice, but too much of justice just means that you gain too much. The idea here of justice is that each person gets what they deserve. So if you get more than you deserve, then you gain. If you get less than what you deserve, that is disadvantage. So justice is understanding what one deserves and allocating that to the person, neither too much nor too little. The practical reason is prudence. That's the thing that tells us what actions help us toward justice, what actions help us toward courage or temperance, and how do we do it? Also, what happens when justice or courage or temperance come into conflict, when it might seem that an action might bring us closer towards justice, but farther from temperance? How do we manage that situation? That is also the realm of prudence. Too much prudence means that you just sit in a chair and think all day and don't do anything. Too little means that all you're doing is acting without thinking at all. So the virtue, again, exists between two extremes of vice. It's also possible to derive each of these general virtues from a relationship. Temperance, for example, is a relationship to yourself because you're finding self-control over yourself. Also, to become selfish is literally to focus on yourself. Justice is your relationship to the world. Justice calls you outside of yourself to care about things outside of yourself. Courage usually is expressed in relationship to specific others, not the world at large, but not just yourself. It's a specific relationship. More on that in just a second. I should also mention that prudence is the one that comes about through education and experience. All the other virtues we're born with some baseline level, but prudence must be developed through education experience. It's not necessarily something that we're born with. The theological virtues, they are needed to complete our set of virtues, and they are, just like in Corinthians chapter 13, faith, hope, and love, but they're not really useful in this life. They're useful to us achieving our last end, being unified with God. They aren't also means between extremes. The theological virtues have no vices attached to them. We're all passive with regard to the theological virtues. God perfects them in us. We do our best to stay out of the way. They don't do a lot of work. They're only useful in the end. So they're pretty slippery because essentially they are, unless they aren't. I just put this orange list here just to acknowledge the fact that this is not a complete list of virtues. There have been others that have been thought of by Aristotle, by other thinkers, but I just wanted to give you Thomas Aquinas' list as an example, and then discard it in the next slide. Great, that's what we're going to do. Because what this misses, and what I kind of pointed at in terms of talking about relationships, is that we're inherently relational beings. That one of the things about us is that we experience virtue in our relationship with other people. That's where virtue actually means something. That actions that are virtuous affect our relationships with other people. So James Keenan, Jesuit priest, working out of Boston, modified the virtues to come up with a different set, because there's no reason that Thomas Aquinas got it right in the 13th century. These things evolve over time. So Keenan came up with the idea that what if we looked at our relationships to derive virtues? That notice that relationships are unique. That be our relationship with ourselves. They are specific, our relationships with close people, or they're general, our relationships with the world. And he modified, for example, the virtue of temperance to self-care and courage to fidelity. And we'll see how it works in just a second. Prudence and justice remain the same. Again, it's difficult to achieve consensus, and it isn't really tell us how to write laws or policies to govern all people, but it is inherently able to address the fact that our actions affect other people and that we derive our meaning from our relationships with other people. So let's talk about this self-care idea. Self-care can look like assertiveness, but it's not. Self-care encompasses assertiveness and piety, which is a commitment to spiritual practice. Self-care is hobbies, where we find ourselves outside of our work. Self-care is our relationships with family and friends. Self-care is all the things that allow us to be flourishing as individuals, as ourselves. So, for example, humility is an aspect of self-care. When that is in excess, then we have pride. With a defect, abnegation, when we don't care about ourselves at all. Piety is an aspect of self-care. When there's too much of that, then we get judgy about others and people call us pious as an insult. But if there's too little piety, then it's only about ourselves. Authenticity is an element of self-care. If there's too much of it, those friends that are too authentic, that's definitely like a boundary crossing thing, TMI. Too much information, people that overshare. But if there's a lack of authenticity, then we experience people as being aloof, not really relatable. These are all elements of self-care. Fidelity. Fidelity is about our relationships to specific people that we're given extra bonds with. It could be something like a parent and child, husband and a wife, two partners. It could be something like a doctor and a patient. Things where we have a special obligation that is not like our relationship to other people that we meet on the street. That's what fidelity governs. Okay, let's go on to this. So I've given you examples of how virtues exist between vices. So let's, as a practice, if you want to unmute yourselves and call this out, what do you think would be the vice of excess of self-care? What happens when you care about yourself too much? Anyone? Or lack. So there are 4 blanks here. Um, Too much fidelity. Can there be such a thing? What about too little fidelity? I mentioned that justice is the same between the two, but even justice, it's fun to think about. What does too much justice look like? Well, then you're a doormat. You never stand up for yourself. All you do is, it is not a great life. It is not a flourishing life when all you're doing is rushing around the world saving other people. but too little justice, and it's greedy. You're just caring about yourself. Well, in the interest of time, I'm going to go on. Here's the table completed. So self-care as a virtue. Too much of it, selfish. Too little, self-negation. You don't adequately take care of your own needs. Someone that's so busy with their work caring about other people that they forget to exercise or eat well, and their health deteriorates. It's self-negation. Neither of them is good. So a virtuous life, a right decision, is always asking, does this action, how do I become a person that understands, that lives in accordance with self-care, neither selfishness nor self-negation, fidelity, understanding what are those special relationships in my life that I have an extra responsibility to, without becoming either codependent or forgetting about my relationships, my special obligations, infidelity. Remembering also justice. What is my relationship to the world at large? And also, what happens when an action calls into conflict, calls these three values into conflict? Prudence. And by figuring these things out, we get better at navigating these minefields. Cool. So that is a model for ethical decision-making from the perspective of 20th century or 21st century virtue ethics. Self-care, fidelity, justice, and prudence. Your relationship to yourself, your relationship to those people that are very close to you, your relationship to the world, and prudence, which helps you to figure out what's the right thing to do. How do you act on those? Back to Exodus. So let's put this into practice and do something that's really, really not good biblical scholarship, but really interesting ethics. Not good biblical scholarship because understanding Exodus, it is written as law. It is expected to be law and obeyed simply because God said it. So this is very much deontological. That is the model that we should be using, but we're going to apply virtue ethics to it to try to get to some interesting conclusions. We're going to look at only at the highlighted passages. I should also mention there's a red bracket because it turns out that not all people count the 10 commandments the same way. So if you look at the bullet points here, you'll actually notice that there are 11 of them, because essentially there are 11 commandments. People who are Catholic or Lutheran count the last two as two separate commandments. You shall not covet your neighbor's house as a separate commandment, then you shall not covet your neighbor's wife or male servant, all of that. Those are two separate commandments, and as a consequence, they push together the first two. You shall have no other gods beside me. You shall not make yourself a sculpted image. That's all one commandment. Protestants, the rest of Protestantism and Judaism tends to split the first two and count the last two together as one. So that's just that's being indicated here, that when you're having a conversation and you don't know what the other person is, you might be disagreeing about commandments, not because you disagree about them, just because you're counting them differently, you're talking about different commandments. Okay. You shall have no other gods before me. So, some just comments about this. It's a tricky passage because it turns out that the word before is actually in the locative case. It's a way in Hebrew to talk about positions, like actual spatial relationships between things. And so the Hebrew here, alpanai, is literally saying here, don't put other statues of gods in front of me. We traditionally understand this to mean you shall have no other gods other than me, but that would be a completely different grammatical construction. And in Deuteronomy, alpanai is preserved. So it is what it means. And well, you have to ask the question, well, what other gods would you have? There's only one God, right? Well, that's what we thought until 1976, when we discovered pottery fragments from temple. And it has since been, I mean, there have been other confirmations that I'm not saying here what exists in the world, like whether God is singular or plural. I'm telling you that archaeology tells us that people long ago thought that God had a wife, Asherah. So the inscription says Yahweh and his Asherah with a depiction. And so Asherah, we know, was a Canaanite goddess that was present in the other surrounding cultures and was usually described or represented with an Asherah stick or a column, or sometimes a cow, or a female goddess deity. So we think that this commandment was actually about where to positionally place the Asherah idol, that you shall not place it in front of Yahweh. Behind Yahweh would be fine. In another room would be fine. Just don't put it positionally in front of Yahweh. Okay, that's an aside, but it's important for you to know, because that's actual biblical scholarship. Let's think about this as not a command. Let's think about this as a virtue. So the virtue here, what this is asking us to do, is to think of God in right relationship to other gods, other deities. What happens if there's an excess of this? So if it's only God, that's monotheism. What about a deficiency if we don't think of God as being special relative to other gods? That's pantheism. God is just one amongst many. I know that we're conditioned to think of this, of our religion, as monotheistic. Unfortunately, the scriptures simply don't state that. There are many other gods. That's why it's important not to pray to the other gods, not because you'd be praying to just a piece of wood. It's because those other gods actually do things. The prohibitions about sacrifices to other gods, why people are instructed not to go and consult the witch of Endor, or to consult dead spirits, is because it's actually effective. That's what the problem is. If it wasn't, then there would be no concern. You'd just be sacrificing to nothing. And it really wouldn't be as offensive. So here we're understanding this commandment as biblical scholars as being the understanding of God in right relationship with other deities. And that can be really scary for us. It can also be really freeing for us, especially in our relationships with other people in our lives, smart people who believe in other gods. They're not stupid. It is possible for us to be, as Christians, in respectful relationship with people who have differing beliefs than us. And for us to say that they're dumb, they believe in something that doesn't exist, is really offensive and actually harms our relationships with other people and our Christian witness, that we're caring people, that we consider, that we're thoughtful, that we listen. So it's possible that the excess of this virtue actually hurts our relationships with other people. And what we're called to do as Christians is to actually understand our God in relationship to other deities. Ooh, that was kind of crazy. Let's skip number 2 and go on to number 3. You shall not swear falsely by the name of God, Yahweh, for Yahweh will not clear anyone who swears falsely by God's name. This has a legal context to it. It is about testimony. If this was about taking the Lord's name in vain, as in saying, like, don't say the word God with the word damn afterward, for example, that would be very different, because it's not about testimony. It's not about swearing falsely. Here we're concerned about false testimony that leads to false accusations. It's a really big concern in this time period, in this part of the world. People have heard about the Code of Hammurabi, right? What's the first law in the Code of Hammurabi? It is a prohibition against giving false testimony, swearing by God's name and giving false testimony that leads to a conviction. That first law, the most important law apparently, is that anyone, well, of a certain class of people, a priestly class, if they were to give false testimony that isn't able to be substantiated, they themselves would be put to death. And that's the same concern here. It's about protecting the reputation of God. Because if you swear falsely by God's name, then God becomes essentially meaningless. It's like the boy who cried wolf. It's not a prohibition against using God's name. So the virtue here is using God's name truthfully, and protecting God's reputation for truth. The excess, if you use God's name all the time, is that you dilute the specialness of God's reputation. If you never use God's name, it's to make God insignificant. People would forget that God has any power, or God's name has any reputation, any claim to truth with it. So both the excess and the deficiency take us farther away from what is actually being emphasized here, the virtue, which is the idea that God's name has appropriate uses. Do not use it inappropriately, either excess or not enough. I'd also suggested another way to talk about this is to misrepresent one as a Christian. For example, it is about, well, there was an article in NPR's All Things Considered about Russell Moore, the former leader of the Southern Baptist Convention. He told a story about after preaching on the Beatitudes, the sayings of Jesus, where, blessed are the meek is mentioned. He was asked by a member of the audience where he got those liberal talking points from. He was preaching at the Southern Baptist Convention at a meeting. And he pointed out that those were the words of Jesus Christ. The person responded to him saying, not an apology, but said, those don't work anymore. That's weak. So when we reject what it actually means to be a Christian, when we claim, as this picture, this is a picture from January 6th, when we claim to do things that are against God in the name of God, this is what it means, I think, to swear falsely by the name of God, to claim that, for example, we are a Christian nation and to disregard the poor that live here. It's not hypocrisy. This is taking the Lord's name in vain. Okay, we're almost done. Remember the Sabbath day, keep it holy. What does this mean? This is an obligation to work. It applies to all creation, and it's an obligation to rest as well, because the full commandment here is not just remember the Sabbath day, keep it holy. 6 days will you work is the next sentence, right? So I joke to friends oftentimes, what does this say about teachers who take a summer break? Are they breaking this commandment by not working 6 days? It's sort of a joke. But the point being that there is such a thing here as a possibility of excess and deficiency as well. The virtue here is about having a correct work and worship balance, or a correct work and rest balance. An excess of worship, if you thought that keeping 1 day for the Sabbath was what this commandment was, well, what if we kept 7 days of the Sabbath? Then you'd never work at all. That would not be an excess of virtue that would be a good thing. That would be an excess of virtue that would be a vice. That would be never actually doing anything industrious. It is actually kind of funny to me that 35% of ultra-Orthodox Jewish men work full-time, and over 50% of them, over 50% of them don't have, or only 50% of them work at all. 35% full-time, so I guess 15% part-time. And that's because they spend the rest of their time just studying the Torah for the rest of their lives. Their wives are tasked with bringing in all the money necessary for the household, which means that at least in Brooklyn and in parts of New York City, there are some ultra-Orthodox families that are right at the poverty line because they study so much that they don't actually work. The deficiency of this virtue here would be a lack of reverence, to work all the time, to never take time to work, to keep a Sabbath day holy. I'm maybe playing a little bit fast and loose because the commandment itself doesn't actually mention worship. It just mentions keeping the day holy, but does not define that. But it is a reminder that our time is not to do with as we please. This Mark, the gospel, will say that the Sabbath was made for human beings, not human beings for the Sabbath. And note that it applies to all creation, even animals and strangers. So this is not just binding on the people of Israel, because God created all of creation. And on the seventh day, God rested for all of creation. And so this is something that is about how human beings are made to rest, to be industrious 6 days, and to also take a day off, to give ourselves a break, to be kind to ourselves. In some ways, this is the virtue of self-care. Honor your father and mother. This is a virtue as well. This is the virtue of fidelity, to think of our fathers and mothers as a special relationship that we have a unique obligation to. It is possible to over-honor your father and mother. That's called codependence. Talk to my therapist about that, and my ex-partner. Uh, I have mother issues, it turns out. But the deficiency of virtue is infidelity, of not remembering your parents. And that's probably how we understand this most. We never think about the excess. But it is important for us to be in right relationship with our parents. What's interesting here, though, is the word honor. It only appears 4 times in the scriptures, and twice are in commandments in the Deuteronomy chapter 5 version of the 10 commandments, in the Exodus chapter 20, and 2 other times. It is not the verb for love. It is a verb that has a financial implication. And we think that the reason that this commandment came about was because in an early agrarian society, people's survival was dependent on their economic output, their ability to grow a crop and feed themselves through a winter, through a growing season. And as folks got older, that capacity declined. This is a commandment to make sure that your parents are fed, to literally not go out and find a glacier for your parents, or not to have a pillow with their name on it. It is the only commandment that has a promise as well. And the promise makes sense from this perspective, that you may long endure on the land that God, Yahweh, is assigning to you. Because if you model for your kids by taking care of your parents in their old age, by making sure that they're fed, then maybe your kids will also do the same for you, and you will live a long life. Because if you don't do this for your parents, and your kids don't see that as a model, and they don't feed you, you will not have a long life. Because as your economic productivity drops off, you will also starve, because you did not model that for your children. The other 2 instances, Numbers 24, verse 11, there it's the word honor is actually sometimes translated instead as reward, because it is a story about Balak paying Balaam in payment for Balaam cursing Balak's enemies. So he's saying, did I not reward you for this task that I asked you to do, and why haven't you done it? And so the word could there be translated either as honor you or reward you, but it's clearly talking about a monetary payment. Also, Proverbs 3, chapter 3, verse 9, and the verse here is, honor the Lord from your wealth and with the first fruits of your produce. So again, it's not about some idea of respect. It's about literally paying your tithe to God. So here, honor really does have a financial aspect to it. Okay, back to the one that I skipped. Maybe the most important for me, most interesting. Idolatry. You shall not make for yourself a sculpted image. You shall not bow down to them or serve them. So this is the explanation for the word, what the word graven actually means, because it's not a word that we use in our everyday language. Some of us know this verse as, you shall not make for yourself a graven image. Some people will see this as, know this as an idol, but that's a pretty recent translation. This is a commandment against 3-dimensional carved images of God. That is what graven means. It's related to our word that we use in English called engrave. So it means to scratch out, to carve. So it is not a prohibition against 2-dimensional images, interestingly enough. And that is why, for example, in the Sistine Chapel, this painting of God is not a violation of the commandment, because it is a 2-dimensional painting of God. It is not a sculpted image. It's also why we don't have idols of Yahweh. We do have sculptures of Jesus. Anyone who's seen a Catholic crucifix with Jesus on the cross knows that that's fine, because this was from the Hebrew scriptures referring to Yahweh, not to Jesus. It also is taken to be part of the reason that Jews thought it to be kind of dangerous to use coinage in the Roman Empire that had Tiberius's head on it. That's why we have coins in this image as well, because the inscription identifies Tiberius, the emperor at the time, as a god. And so to use, because it's, here we have a 3-dimensional image on a coin embossed into a coin, not just a painted image, not a flat image, that was in danger of breaking this commandment. So when, for example, Jesus asks the Pharisee, when the Pharisees ask him, do we pay taxes to Caesar? And Jesus asks the Pharisee for a coin, and the Pharisee pulls out a coin and he says, pay unto Caesar what is Caesar's. That Pharisee was not supposed to have that coin. They were supposed to change their money. There was a special currency that was authorized only in Judea, which did not have the emperor's head on it. That was authorized only for Jews to use to be able to avoid breaking this commandment. And the Pharisee pulling out a coin that had the emperor's face on it was himself admitting guilt. That's the point of that story. When we think about why there were money changers in the temple when Jesus cleanses the temple, that's also here an excess of caution against idolatry. It's the excess, not the virtue here, because people were so afraid about, again, this coinage breaking this commandment that they had to change their coinage at the temple to be able to offer their sacrifice to God to pay their temple tax in the right coinage. And the money changers were making a profit off of that. So out of an excess of obedience to this commandment came sin, which was taking money from people as a money changer in the temple. That's part of what Jesus was so angry about. So here the virtue is recognizing God where God is. The excess, idolatry, is to look at a three-dimensional carved idol, a figurine, and to recognize that as God, to find God where God is not. That is not God. And so to identify that as God is the excess. That is a vice. But we oftentimes forget, because we don't think about vices as being the extremes and virtues as being the middle ground, the other side of things. So if finding God where God isn't is a vice, then failing to recognize God where God is also a vice. And this is where I'd suggest that we can find racism as being something that is a vice that the Bible actually speaks on. Because to fail to recognize the worthiness of a human being, to fail to recognize the divine image in a human being, to fail to recognize God where God is the opposite, equally the problem of recognizing God in an idol. So this is how virtue ethics can actually recover a lot more information when we read the Ten Commandments through this lens. A couple more notes on idols, though, because this is by far the most powerful, the most damning of all of the commandments. Idols demand sacrifice. Oftentimes the first thing that we are able to recognize as an idol in our lives is money. In this sense, both idols and money share one quality, in that they're the work product of our hands. People carve idols. People make money. People make idols. And the problem is here that we're putting our trust in that which is the product of our own hands, which is not a God. Power could also probably be said to be a work product of our own hands, something that we put our trust in our own power rather than putting our trust in God. But when money becomes an idol, we're seduced by the product of our own work. We're literally enslaved by a God of our own making. But idols have no power, right? We know that. That's what our faith tells us. Carved statues of wood, coins do not have power. They don't speak. They don't actually exert power over us. They don't change our fortunes or our futures. We worship them because someone told us that they were a god. And this is what we have to pay attention to. Because if we ever want to dismantle power, we have to see power where it is. And power's first defense is always to be invisible. So who told us that a carved figure was the same thing as a god? And what did they gain from that? In ancient days, it might have been a priest or a priestess instructing us to worship before a golden image of Baal, a calf, who then took our temple offering for their own enrichment. So someone told us to worship an idol. It's not the idol that has power. It's actually the idol itself worships the person that told us the idol had power. So if money has become what we put our trust in today, who told us to worship money? Today, it's the tech moguls, the Bitcoin entrepreneurs, social media influencers who sell us a lifestyle because of their wealth, if only we had the money to pay for it. These are people whose lifestyles we desire to copy for ourselves. There was a 20th century French literary theorist at Stanford. His name was René Girard. And he wrote that our desire is not object-based. We don't actually want things in life. What we ultimately want is not to have things. We want to be like people. We want to copy someone else's lifestyle. What he actually wrote was that our desire is mimetic. It's that we copy things, not that we have things. So do we actually want money? Or do we want to be like the people whose lifestyle seems comfortable, who live easy, knowing that their mortgage is paid, that they can never spend all the money that they have, that they can afford to not think about scarcity? These are the very people that profit off of our attempts to emulate them, especially when we fail. In the end, the truth about idols is that idols serve the people who told us that the idol was worth serving. These are the ones who told us that money was the same thing as a god. So the danger here is not idol worship. The danger is ceding power to the people that told us that the idol was a god. So be careful about that. When we lust after money at the end of the day, the reason this is wrong, if we made it more simple, is that we hurt people. There's no way not to. So here's the test. Does your worship of an idol increase suffering in the world, or does it decrease suffering? If it decreases suffering, that's the living God. If it increases suffering, it is an idol. One last thought about this commandment was shared with me by a Jewish classmate. It's pretty cool. She described idol worship as the ossification of God. It comes from the word for bone. It's when God, who is living, God who is described as mystery, unknowable, infinite, becomes contained in a three-dimensional image, becomes contained in something finite, something that is in one place that has a set image that cannot change. So perhaps when we say things like, well, the Bible condemns homosexuality, so therefore homosexuality is wrong, using a context from 2,000 years ago as a moral guideline for our lives today, perhaps we're committing the sin of idolatry because we are making God stuck in time. God turns to bone. God grows roots and becomes firmly planted in just one place. God ceases to be living. God ceases to be dynamic, changing. We forget the mystery, the infinite of God, the unknowableness of God. And we say what God is with certainty. Anytime we're certain about God, maybe that's when we also run into idolatry. Okay, so that was a lot. That was ethics, that was technique, that was method, that was the 10 Commandments, and I still have another 3 hours to talk. So we're going to end things here. I'm going to apologize to all of you for running long, and see you on Sunday.